You think you could drive around here without explaining yourself? Step out of the car and keep your hands where I can see them. On what should have been an ordinary drive home, an arrogant police officer decided to harass and intimidate a calm black woman during a routine traffic stop, never realizing that 10 minutes later a U.S. Army colonel would arrive and dismantle his career right there on the side of the road. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden shadows across the highway just outside Fort Hamilton, where rows of pine trees lined the road and the distant outline of the military base could be seen beyond the fence line. Danielle Carter drove steadily along the quiet suburban road, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel while the other adjusted the strap of the small work badge that hung from her purse on the passenger seat. It had been a long day inside the logistics office on base, and she was looking forward to nothing more complicated than dinner and a quiet evening at home. The hum of her engine blended with the occasional passing car as she followed the speed limit through the stretch of highway that curved gently toward town. In the distance, a black and white patrol cruiser sat parked along the shoulder beneath a faded road sign. Inside the cruiser, Officer Jake Donovan leaned forward behind the steering wheel, watching traffic with the sharp impatience that had become his habit during patrol. Beside him sat Officer Mark Ellis, who scrolled quietly through dispatch notes on the patrol tablet. "Looks like a slow shift," Ellis muttered. Donovan did not answer right away. His eyes had already locked onto Danielle's car as it passed the cruiser. Something about the vehicle caught his attention, though nothing about it stood out to anyone else on the road. The car was clean, the speed was normal, and the driver maintained a steady lane. But Donovan had already decided something was wrong. "There," he said suddenly, straightening in his seat. Ellis glanced up. "What about it?" Donovan nodded toward Danielle's car, now moving down the road ahead of them. "That one." Ellis frowned slightly. "She is not speeding." Donovan reached for the ignition without another word. The cruiser engine roared to life as he pulled onto the highway and accelerated behind Danielle. Blue and red lights flashed across the rear window of her car, reflecting brightly in her mirror. Danielle exhaled softly and eased the vehicle toward the shoulder, bringing it to a smooth stop along the side of the road. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the patrol cruiser pulled in behind her. Donovan stepped out of the vehicle with the confident stride of someone who believed the next few minutes belonged entirely to him. Danielle placed both hands calmly on the steering wheel as he approached, unaware that the officer now walking toward her door had already made up his mind about the kind of driver he believed she must be. Officer Jake Donovan stopped beside Danielle Carter's driver's side window and leaned slightly toward the glass, his shadow falling across the dashboard. Danielle kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, exactly where he could see them. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol cruiser reflected softly across the windshield, painting brief streaks of color across the quiet highway. Donovan tapped the window sharply with 2 fingers. Danielle lowered it calmly. "License and registration," he said immediately. Danielle reached slowly toward her purse on the passenger seat. "Of course," she replied evenly. She retrieved her license and registration and handed them to him without hesitation. Donovan glanced at the cards briefly before looking back down at her with narrowed eyes. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Work," Danielle answered. "Where is that?" "Fort Hamilton." Donovan tilted his head slightly as if the answer annoyed him. "Military base." Danielle nodded once. "Yes." Donovan studied her again for a moment longer than necessary, clearly searching for something that justified the stop he had already decided to make. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered suddenly. Danielle blinked once in mild surprise. "May I ask why?" Donovan's jaw tightened immediately. "Because I told you to." Danielle remained calm. "Officer, I was not speeding." Donovan ignored the comment entirely and opened the door himself. Out of the car, Danielle stepped onto the shoulder of the road, gravel crunching beneath her shoes. The late afternoon sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the highway and the patrol cruiser parked behind them. Officer Mark Ellis approached from the passenger side of the cruiser, watching the scene with a cautious expression. Donovan walked around Danielle's car slowly, as if inspecting it for evidence of something he had not yet invented. "What exactly do you do on base?" he asked over his shoulder. "Logistics analyst," Danielle replied. Donovan stopped beside the rear door and glanced back at her. "Sounds complicated." Danielle said nothing. Ellis leaned closer to Donovan and lowered his voice slightly. "Jake, we can just issue a warning." Donovan waved him off. "I have not decided what she is getting yet." He turned back toward Danielle and pointed toward the hood of the patrol car. "Hands on the vehicle." Danielle hesitated only a moment before walking to the cruiser and placing her palms flat against the warm metal surface. Passing cars slowed slightly as drivers noticed the flashing lights and the roadside stop. Donovan stepped closer behind her, clearly satisfied with the scene he had created. "You know something," he said, his voice filled with quiet arrogance. "People get real nervous around here when they are hiding something." Danielle turned her head slightly. "I am not hiding anything." Donovan reached toward her purse, still sitting on the passenger seat of her car, and pulled it out, dumping the contents across the cruiser hood. Papers, a phone, and a military access badge slid across the metal surface. Ellis stared at the badge briefly before looking up again. "Jake," he started quietly. Donovan picked up the badge and glanced at it before tossing it aside, dismissively. "Everyone claims they work on base," he said with a smirk. Danielle remained steady beside the cruiser. "Officer Donovan," she said calmly, reading the name printed on his uniform badge, "you are making a mistake." Donovan laughed softly. "That is what they all say." He reached for the handcuffs hanging from his belt and lifted them slightly so she could see them glinting in the sunlight. "Let us see how calm you stay in a minute." Officer Jake Donovan spun the handcuffs once in his hand, the metal rings catching the sunlight as he stepped closer behind Danielle Carter. The quiet stretch of highway suddenly felt smaller, the flashing patrol lights reflecting off the side of her car and the asphalt beneath their feet. Danielle remained steady with her palms resting against the cruiser hood, her posture calm despite the tension growing behind her. Passing drivers slowed as they approached the scene, their curious glances briefly fixed on the roadside stop before continuing down the highway. Donovan leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping into a tone meant to intimidate. "You know what usually happens when people say I am making a mistake," he said. Danielle turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "What usually happens?" Donovan lifted the cuffs slightly so the steel links clinked together. They end up explaining that mistake to a judge. Officer Mark Ellis shifted uneasily a few feet away. "Jake," he said quietly, "she has not done anything." Donovan ignored him completely. He grabbed Danielle's wrist and pulled it gently behind her back. "Let's make sure of that." Danielle did not resist the movement, but her voice remained calm. "Officer Donovan, there is still time to stop." Donovan chuckled under his breath. "You keep saying that." The cuff snapped closed around her wrist with a sharp metallic click. The sound echoed across the quiet highway shoulder. Ellis rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable now. "Jake, we can just write a warning." Donovan tightened his grip slightly as he brought her other wrist behind her back. "I do not remember asking you." The second cuff closed with another snap. Danielle stood quietly beside the cruiser, her wrists secured, but her expression unchanged. The wind moved softly through the trees lining the road while the patrol lights continued flashing in slow pulses across the pavement. Donovan stepped back slightly, clearly satisfied with the scene he had created. "Now," he said, folding his arms across his chest, "we can start figuring out what you were really doing out here." Danielle glanced briefly at the military access badge that had slid across the cruiser hood earlier before returning her gaze forward. "Officer Donovan," she said calmly, "you should check that badge again." Donovan picked it up casually and glanced at it for barely a second before tossing it back down. "Everyone claims they work on base," he replied dismissively. Ellis leaned closer, studying the badge more carefully this time. His expression shifted slightly. "Jake," Donovan shook his head impatiently. "Relax." Danielle lifted her eyes toward the open road ahead of them. "May I make a phone call?" she asked quietly. Donovan laughed. You think someone is coming to rescue you? Danielle did not respond immediately. Just a call, she said. Donovan shrugged and stepped back toward the cruiser. Fine, he said with a smirk. Call whoever you want. He leaned casually against the patrol car door, completely convinced that the situation remained firmly under his control, unaware that the single call he had just allowed would set something in motion that he could not stop. Officer Jake Donovan leaned casually against the patrol cruiser as Danielle Carter lifted her cuffed hands just enough to reach into the side pocket of her purse resting on the hood of the vehicle. The late afternoon wind carried the distant hum of traffic along the highway, and the flashing patrol lights reflected across the gravel shoulder where the confrontation had unfolded. Passing drivers slowed slightly as they noticed the scene, some glancing curiously before continuing down the road. Danielle carefully pulled her phone from the purse and balanced it between her fingers despite the steel cuffs still locked around her wrists. Donovan watched with a thin smile that suggested the entire situation amused him. Go ahead, he said. Call whoever you think is going to help. Danielle tapped the screen and raised the phone toward her ear. Her voice remained calm when the call connected. Hi, Dad, she said quietly. I'm on Route 17, just outside the Fort Hamilton entrance. Donovan chuckled softly when he heard the word. Calling your father, he muttered sarcastically. That is always a good move. Danielle continued speaking without acknowledging him. 2 officers pulled me over and placed me in handcuffs, she explained evenly. Yes, I am fine. She paused for a moment while listening to the voice on the other end. Officer Mark Ellis shifted uneasily beside the cruiser as he watched the conversation unfold. Donovan folded his arms and glanced toward the empty highway behind them, clearly convinced that nothing about the call could change the situation. Danielle nodded slightly as she listened. Yes, she said calmly. I will stay here. The call ended a moment later. She lowered the phone carefully and placed it back onto the cruiser hood. Donovan raised an eyebrow. That it? He asked. Danielle turned her head slightly toward him. Yes. Donovan laughed under his breath. So let me guess, he said, pacing slowly in front of her now. Your father is coming to pick you up? Danielle did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the road ahead where the highway curved toward the entrance of the military base several miles away. The faint rumble of distant engines carried through the warm air. Something like that, she said quietly. Donovan shook his head and leaned back against the cruiser again. You know, he continued, people think they can scare officers by pretending they have connections. Ellis looked at the highway again, then back at Donovan. Jake, he said quietly, maybe we should check the badge she dropped earlier. Donovan waved his hand dismissively. Already looked at it. Danielle remained calm beside the cruiser, her posture steady despite the cuffs resting against her wrists. She spoke again, her voice measured but certain. Officer Donovan, she said, this is the last opportunity you have to undo what you started. Donovan smiled faintly, completely unconcerned. Relax, he replied. 10 minutes from now, you will be explaining this to a judge. He had no way of knowing that the 10 minutes he had just mentioned were about to change everything about the situation he believed he controlled. The late afternoon sun slid lower along the horizon as the minutes passed on the quiet stretch of Route 17 outside Fort Hamilton. The flashing patrol lights continued painting pulses of red and blue across the asphalt, while Danielle Carter stood calmly beside the cruiser with her wrists still secured behind her back. Officer Jake Donovan leaned casually against the driver's side door, clearly unconcerned with the call she had just made. The wind moved softly through the roadside trees, carrying the distant rumble of vehicles from the highway ahead. Officer Mark Ellis stood several feet away, watching the road more carefully now, his expression tightening as he scanned the horizon. Donovan noticed and shook his head. You look like you were expecting a parade, he said with a smirk. Ellis kept his eyes on the highway. I just think we should slow down. Donovan laughed under his breath. She called her father Mark. Danielle remained composed, her gaze steady on the road stretching out ahead of them. The silence that followed felt heavier now, broken only by the soft clicking of the cruiser engine cooling in the heat. Donovan finally pushed himself off the patrol car and stepped closer to Danielle again. You know, he said, folding his arms across his chest. Most people start apologizing around this point. Danielle did. Not move. For what? Donovan tilted his head slightly. For wasting my time. Ellis glanced back toward the highway once more, and then toward Donovan. Jake, he began. Donovan ignored him again. Instead, he reached down and picked up the military access badge that had fallen earlier onto the hood of the cruiser. He looked at it again briefly before tossing it back onto the metal surface. Everyone around here claims they work on base, he said dismissively. Danielle's voice remained calm. You might want to look at it more carefully. Donovan waved his hand as if brushing away the suggestion. You already tried that. Ellis stepped forward and picked up the badge again, studying it longer this time. His eyes narrowed slightly. Jake, he said more firmly now. Donovan turned toward him impatiently. What? Ellis held the badge up so the sunlight caught the printed text. This is real. Donovan rolled his eyes. It is plastic. Ellis looked at Danielle and then back at Donovan. It says Department of Defense Contractor Clearance. Donovan snorted. So, Danielle remained steady beside the cruiser. So it means I have access to Fort Hamilton, she replied quietly. Donovan shrugged again. Lots of people do. Ellis lowered the badge slowly, still studying the road ahead. The faint rumble of approaching engines had grown louder now. At first it sounded like distant traffic. Then the shape of dark vehicles appeared over the curve in the highway. 2 military SUVs moved quickly down the road, their presence unmistakable even before they reached the flashing patrol lights. Ellis stared. Jake! Donovan followed his gaze and frowned slightly as the vehicle slowed near the roadside stop. Danielle remained calm, watching them approach with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning. Donovan's earlier confidence flickered for the first time as the first SUV rolled to a stop behind the patrol cruiser, its door opening before the engine had even fully shut off. The 2 dark military SUVs rolled to a stop behind the patrol cruiser, their engines rumbling softly as dust lifted from the roadside shoulder. The sudden arrival shifted the atmosphere along Route 17. Officer Mark Ellis stood frozen for a moment, his eyes moving from the vehicles to Danielle Carter and then back again. Officer Jake Donovan, however, forced a thin smile and shook his head as if the situation still belonged entirely to him. Relax, he muttered. Probably just passing through. Danielle remained calm beside the cruiser, her wrists still secured behind her back. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the black paint of the arriving vehicles as the first SUV door opened slowly. A tall figure stepped out but remained partly hidden behind the vehicle for the moment. The pause that followed felt heavy, as if the road itself had gone quiet. Donovan cleared his throat and reached for the citation pad still resting on the cruiser hood. All right, he said, snapping it open again with exaggerated confidence. We're done waiting. Ellis looked at him quickly. Jake, maybe we should just... Donovan cut him off. No. He began writing across the page again, the pen scratching loudly against the paper. Failure to comply, he muttered. Suspicious activity. Danielle watched him calmly. Officer Donovan, she said quietly, you are about to make the worst decision of your career. Donovan chuckled without looking up. You already said that. The pen continued moving across the paper. Danielle lifted her eyes toward the military vehicles again. The tall figure had stepped fully into view now, though Donovan still had his back turned. The crisp lines of a military uniform caught the sunlight. You still have time to stop, Danielle continued, her voice steady and controlled. Donovan tore the citation from the pad and folded it once. You know what I have learned doing this job, he said while turning back toward her. People love making dramatic warnings right before they realize they are in trouble. Danielle did not move. This is not a warning, she replied softly. It is the final opportunity one am giving you. Donovan laughed again and stepped closer, holding the citation between 2 fingers. And what exactly happens if I do not take that opportunity? Danielle's gaze remained calm. You will find out in a moment. Donovan shrugged dismissively and gestured toward the back seat of the cruiser. Get ready to explain that to a judge. He had not yet noticed the sound of boots stepping slowly across the gravel behind him. Ellis had. His eyes widened slightly as the tall officer in uniform approached from behind the cruiser. The silence that followed stretched across the roadside like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. And in that moment, without realizing it, Officer Jake Donovan stepped past the final. Chance he had been given a walk away before the truth, standing behind him, changed everything. Officer Jake Donovan began to turn back toward Danielle Carter with the folded citation still in his hand, the confident smirk on his face fading the moment he noticed Officer Mark Ellis staring past him with a stunned expression. Donovan frowned slightly. "What?" he asked impatiently. Ellis did not answer. Instead, he stepped back one pace, his posture suddenly rigid with attention. The sound of boots moving across the gravel shoulder grew louder behind Donovan, steady and deliberate. Slowly, Donovan turned. The tall man, approaching from the military vehicle, carried himself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. His uniform was immaculate, the insignia on his chest catching the afternoon sunlight as he stepped forward. Behind him walked Military Police Sergeant Linda Ortega, her eyes already scanning the scene with professional focus. Colonel Marcus Carter stopped beside the patrol cruiser and looked directly at Donovan. His expression was calm, but the weight of his presence shifted the air along the roadside instantly. Donovan's confidence disappeared in a heartbeat. His shoulders stiffened, the citation paper slipping slightly between his fingers. "What is going on here?" the colonel asked quietly. His voice was not raised, yet it carried more authority than Donovan's shouting had minutes earlier. Ellis spoke immediately. "Sir, this traffic stop." Donovan interrupted him, though his voice had lost its earlier arrogance. "This is police business." The colonel's gaze did not move. "You placed my daughter in handcuffs." Donovan blinked. The words landed like a sudden blow. "Your daughter?" he repeated. Colonel Carter stepped closer to Danielle. His eyes softened slightly as he looked at her. "Are you all right?" Danielle nodded calmly. "I am fine." Sergeant Ortega stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs from Danielle's wrists with a quick metallic click. The steel fell away, leaving faint red marks where they had rested. Danielle rubbed her wrists briefly before lowering her hands again. Donovan stared at the colonel, the color draining slowly from his face as the realization settled over him. The calm woman he had pushed against the cruiser was not simply another driver on the highway. She was the daughter of a United States Army colonel standing directly in front of him. Colonel Carter turned his attention back to Donovan. "Officer," he said evenly, "explain why my daughter was detained." Donovan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The earlier arrogance that had fueled every decision he made now dissolved under the steady gaze of the man before him. Ellis looked away toward the road, clearly understanding the gravity of the moment. Danielle stepped quietly beside her father, her calm composure unchanged. And standing there on the shoulder of Route 17, with the flashing patrol lights reflecting across the uniforms and the quiet road stretching into the distance, Officer Jake Donovan finally understood that the situation he believed he controlled had just collapsed completely around him. The quiet stretch of Route 17 had turned tense in a way no one standing there could ignore. Officer Jake Donovan remained frozen beside the patrol cruiser, the folded citation still hanging loosely in his hand, while Colonel Marcus Carter stood calmly only a few feet away. The afternoon wind moved across the highway shoulder, rustling the nearby grass, while the flashing patrol lights continued pulsing against the metal of the vehicles. Colonel Carter's gaze never left Donovan. It was not angry. It was steady, controlled, and far more intimidating than any raised voice. "Officer," the colonel said again, "I asked a question." Donovan swallowed hard. The confidence that had carried him through the entire stop had vanished completely. "Sir, I believed she was acting suspicious." The explanation sounded weak even to his own ears. Danielle Carter stood quietly beside her father, rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had been moments earlier. Her posture remained calm, her expression composed, but the red marks around her wrists spoke clearly enough. Colonel Carter looked down at them briefly, then back at Donovan. "You believed," he repeated slowly. Sergeant Linda Ortega stepped forward beside the colonel and turned her attention toward Officer Mark Ellis. "Did you observe any violation?" she asked. Ellis hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. "No, sergeant." The words settled heavily over the roadside. Colonel Carter nodded once. "Then we are finished here." Donovan shifted uneasily. "Sir, I was only doing my job." The colonel's voice remained calm. "Your job does not include abusing authority." Donovan lowered his eyes, unable to hold the colonel's gaze any longer. Sergeant Ortega reached for her radio. "Command, this is Sergeant Ortega. I need a supervisor from the department on scene immediately." The response crackled back through the speaker. Within minutes, another patrol vehicle arrived, and a senior police lieutenant stepped out. The moment he saw the colonel and the military vehicles, his expression changed instantly. "Colonel Carter," he said with a respectful nod. The colonel returned the nod. "Lieutenant, I believe you have a situation that requires attention." The lieutenant looked at Donovan, then at Danielle's wrists, and finally at the scattered papers and badge resting on the cruiser hood. The picture became clear immediately. "Officer Donovan," he said firmly, "remove your badge." The command hit harder than any shout could have. Donovan's hands moved slowly toward his chest where the metal badge was clipped. The quiet click as he removed it sounded impossibly loud in the open air. The lieutenant took it without another word. "You are relieved of duty pending investigation," he continued. Ellis stepped back silently, while Donovan stared at the ground, his earlier arrogance replaced with stunned silence. Danielle watched calmly beside her father as the authority Donovan had used so freely disappeared in front of him. The road grew quiet again as the lieutenant turned toward Colonel Carter. "This will be addressed immediately." The colonel gave a small nod. "I expect that it will." And standing there beneath the fading afternoon sun, Officer Jake Donovan realized that the career he had treated so casually had just collapsed in front of everyone who witnessed the moment. The roadside along Route 17 slowly began to settle back into its quiet rhythm as the flashing patrol lights dimmed and the military vehicles prepared to leave. The tension that had filled the air only minutes earlier faded into the warm afternoon breeze moving through the trees beside the highway. Danielle Carter stood beside her car, her posture calm and steady while the last of the supervisors finished speaking with Colonel Marcus Carter. The lieutenant who had relieved Officer Jake Donovan of duty stepped back respectfully. "Colonel Carter, we will follow through with a full internal review," he said. The colonel nodded once. "I expect accountability, Lieutenant." His voice remained calm, but the weight behind the words was unmistakable. A few yards away, Officer Donovan stood quietly near the patrol cruiser where he had just handed over his badge. His shoulders were lowered now, the confidence that had fueled his actions earlier replaced by the heavy silence of someone who finally understood the consequences of his behavior. Officer Mark Ellis remained nearby, watching the scene, with a thoughtful expression that suggested he had learned something important from the moment as well. Danielle bent down briefly and picked up the last of her documents that had scattered earlier across the roadside shoulder. She straightened the pages carefully before placing them back inside her briefcase. Colonel Carter watched her for a moment before speaking quietly. "Are you all right?" Danielle nodded with a small smile. "I am fine." The calm in her voice carried the same quiet strength she had shown from the beginning of the encounter. The colonel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning toward the military vehicles. Sergeant Linda Ortega gave Danielle a respectful nod before stepping back toward the SUV. One by one, the vehicles began to pull away from the roadside, their engines fading into the distance as they returned toward the base. The police cruiser remained parked along the shoulder for a moment longer before the lieutenant signaled for Ellis to move it off the road. Within minutes, the highway looked almost exactly as it had earlier that afternoon. Cars passed steadily along Route 17, the sunlight stretching long across the asphalt as the day slowly moved toward evening. Danielle opened the driver's side door of her car and placed her briefcase gently on the passenger seat. Before getting inside, she paused for a moment and looked down the quiet road. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 20 minutes, yet it had revealed more about power and responsibility than most people understood in a lifetime. She slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As the car emerged smoothly back onto the highway, the roadside returned to its ordinary calm. Behind her, the empty stretch of asphalt stood silent again, but the lesson of what had happened there remained clear. Authority used carelessly can disappear in a single moment when it meets the steady weight of accountability. When you think about what truly happened on that quiet stretch of road, the most important moment was not when the military vehicles arrived. The most important moment was earlier, when Officer Donovan decided that the badge on his chest gave him the right to define the situation before he even understood it. In that moment, he was not enforcing the law. He was protecting his own assumptions. Danielle Carter never tried to overpower him with arguments or anger. She simply allowed time to reveal something deeper than authority on the roadside. Her composure came from knowing that power built on responsibility does not need to prove itself quickly. The contrast between those two mindsets tells us something important about human nature. Ego rushes forward, convinced that control must be asserted immediately. Integrity waits, confident that truth does not require noise to be recognized. When those two forces finally collide, the outcome is almost always the same. Ego collapses the moment it faces a power that does not need to shout. That is why the quiet confidence Danielle carried from the beginning ultimately became the strongest force in the entire story. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.